On a freezing Boston night, an 8-year-old girl chased a billionaire's car through the snow just to return $2 he'd been overpaid. He thought it was a small act of honesty, until weeks later she stood beside him in court, fighting to save the only home her mother had ever protected. The wind coming off the harbor that night felt sharp enough to cut through bone. Winter had settled heavily over Beacon Harbor, Massachusetts, turning the streets into slick ribbons of black ice and melting snow. Most people had already hurried home, escaping the cold as quickly as possible. But one sleek black town car had just pulled away from a dimly lit corner market on Ashcroft Row. Inside sat Ronan Ashford, 38 years old, founder of Ashford Urban Systems, a billionaire whose name was stamped across infrastructure contracts and technology investments from Boston to Seattle. His phone was pressed to his ear as he spoke in the controlled tone of a man used to negotiating million-dollar decisions before breakfast. "Push the redevelopment vote to Thursday," he said calmly. "I want the zoning report finalized before we move." The car eased away from the curb. Then suddenly, "Sir, wait." The driver instinctively slowed. Ronan looked up from his call. Through the windshield he saw something small racing toward them through the swirling snow. A little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her marigold-colored coat was too big for her, the sleeves frayed at the cuffs. Her boots slipped on the wet pavement as she ran, dark strands of hair clinging to her forehead from melted snow. When the car stopped, she reached the window, breathing hard, her cheeks flushed red from the cold. In her small hand were 2 crumpled dollar bills. "You got too much back," she said softly, holding them out. For a moment, Ronan Ashford, who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without blinking, simply stared. The girl had chased a luxury car through a freezing street to return $2. And somehow, in the quiet glow of that street lamp, those $2 suddenly felt heavier than money ever should. Ronan lowered the window the rest of the way, the winter wind spilling into the warm car. The girl stood there quietly, still holding the $2 bills in both hands, as if they carried more responsibility than value. Snowflakes clung to the shoulders of her oversized coat. Up close, Ronan could see that the fabric had been repaired in several places with careful stitching. "You ran after a car for this?" he asked. The girl nodded. "It was yours." Her voice was gentle but certain. Most people would have shrugged and kept the extra change. Some might have even considered it good luck, but this child had chosen freezing wind, slippery streets, and the chance of being ignored, simply to correct a mistake. Ronan accepted the money slowly. "Why didn't you keep it?" he asked. For the first time, the girl looked down at the pavement. "My mom used to say something," she replied after a moment. Ronan waited. She looked back up, her eyes clear despite the cold. She said, "Honest money keeps your heart warm." The sentence was simple, almost old-fashioned. Yet something about it struck Ronan harder than the negotiations he had spent his entire career mastering. "What's your name?" he asked. "Evelyn Wren," she said. Then, after a small pause, she added quietly, "But my mom calls me Evie." Evie glanced nervously over her shoulder toward the corner market they had just left. Her expression shifted from calm to worried. "I should go," she said softly. Ronan frowned slightly. "Why?" She pointed back toward the glowing store window. "My little brother is inside," and suddenly, the story Ronan Ashford thought he was witnessing became something entirely different. Ronan stepped out of the car before he had fully decided to. The cold struck him immediately, biting through the wool of his coat, but he barely noticed. Evie had already turned and begun walking back toward the corner market, her small boots crunching against the wet pavement. Inside, the bell above the door gave a tired metallic ring. The market smelled faintly of coffee cardboard and damp winter coats. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Near the back of the store, beside an old, rattling space heater, a small boy was curled up on a wooden chair. He looked about 5. A gray scarf hung loosely around his neck, slipping down one shoulder. One shoe had come half undone, and in his lap rested a worn, stuffed fox with one button eye. He was asleep in the deep, unguarded way only exhausted children sleep. Evie walked straight to him. She didn't shake him awake. Instead, she gently fixed the loose shoe, tucked the scarf around his neck, and pulled the sleeve of her own coat over his small hand to keep it warm. Every movement was careful, practiced, like something she had done many times before. The cashier, an older man wiping down the counter, looked over and sighed quietly. "They come in here when it gets too cold outside," he murmured to Ronan. The girl always watches the boy. Ronan crouched beside Evie. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently. Evie went still. Not frightened, not dramatic, just still. "Our mom is gone," she said quietly. "And there's nobody else who stays." Outside, wind brushed against the market windows. For the first time in years, Ronan Ashford, who could solve almost any problem with money or influence, felt completely unprepared for the quiet weight of that answer. Because suddenly, the $2 in his hand meant something far greater than honesty. They meant responsibility. The wind outside had grown stronger by the time Ronan and Evie stepped back onto Ashcroft Row. Snowflakes swirled through the yellow streetlights, melting as soon as they touched the wet pavement. Ronan opened the car door. "Let me drive you home," he said gently. Evie hesitated. The hesitation was small, but Ronan noticed it. It wasn't fear. It was pride, the quiet instinct of a child who had already learned not to expect too much from strangers. Behind her, inside the market, Noah stirred slightly in his chair. Evie looked at her brother. Then she looked back at Ronan. "Okay," she said softly. A moment later, the black town car rolled slowly through the narrow winter streets of Beacon Harbor. The heater hummed softly, fogging the windows with warm air. In the back seat, Evie held Noah carefully against her shoulder so he wouldn't wake. The little boy slept deeply, his stuffed fox still tucked under one arm. Ronan watched them through the rearview mirror. The girl never once relaxed her grip on her brother. Even when the car stopped at a red light. Even when the streetlights flickered across the glass. Finally, the car turned onto a quieter block. Old brick buildings lined the street, squeezed between two gleaming luxury towers still under construction. Evie pointed toward one of them. "That one," she said. The car stopped. Ronan stepped out and looked up. The building was called Maple Court. Its bricks were faded, paint peeled from the windowsills. The entry light flickered weakly above the door. To most developers, it would have looked like the last obstacle before a profitable skyline. But when Evie stepped onto the sidewalk and looked up at it, her expression said something very different. She looked at the building the way people look at the last place that still remembers them. The hallway of Maple Court smelled faintly of old paint and radiator heat. Evie led the way up a narrow staircase, careful not to wake Noah. The building creaked softly as winter wind pressed against the outside walls. Apartment 3C sat at the end of the hall. Inside the room was small, barely large enough for a bed, a folding table and a tiny kitchenette built from mismatched shelves and a hot plate resting on a wooden crate. Yet everything was clean. Carefully clean. Evie laid Noah gently on the narrow bed and pulled a worn blanket up around his shoulders. The little boy stirred, clutching his stuffed fox, but didn't wake. Then she moved quietly to the cupboard. Inside were only a few things: 3 cans of soup, a small box of crackers, and 2 chipped bowls. Evie filled a dented pot with water and placed it on the hot plate, standing on tiptoe to turn the knob. "You cook?" Ronan asked quietly. Evie shrugged. "Just easy things." Steam slowly began rising from the pot. Every few seconds she glanced back toward the bed to make sure Noah was still comfortable. Ronan noticed something then. On the small table sat a folded piece of paper, its edges worn soft from being opened again and again. Evie saw where he was looking and gently placed her hand over it. "That's from my mom," she said. Her voice softened immediately. "She left it for me." Ronan nodded respectfully. He didn't ask to read it. Some things he knew had to be offered. not taken. For a moment, the tiny apartment fell quiet, except for the soft bubbling of the soup pot, and Ronan felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest. Because the child standing in front of him wasn't just surviving, she was trying with all the strength she had to protect someone else. Later that evening, the small apartment grew quiet. Noah had eaten a little soup half asleep and curled back under the blanket. The wind tapped gently against the window as night settled over Beacon Harbor. Ronan stood near the door, unsure how long he had already stayed. His calendar for tomorrow was full: investor meetings, redevelopment negotiations, a city planning session. Yet somehow none of that felt as urgent as the fragile stillness inside this tiny room. Evie noticed him glance again at the folded paper on the table. For a moment she hesitated. Then she picked it up and held it out. "You can read it," she said. The paper was thin and creased from years of careful folding. The handwriting was uneven but gentle. Ronan read the words slowly. "If I'm late, be brave. If I'm gone, be kind. Protect Noah. Return what isn't yours. Home is where love stays." For several seconds he didn't speak. Then he folded the paper exactly the way it had been before and handed it back. "Your mother sounds like an incredible person," he said quietly. Evie pressed the note softly against her chest before placing it back on the table. She said, "People can lose a lot of things," Evie murmured. "But if they keep doing the right thing, they won't lose themselves." Ronan looked around the apartment again. The careful order, the small supplies, the sleeping boy. And suddenly he realized something surprising. He had spent his entire life building towers, networks, and companies. But the smallest promise he could make tonight might become the most important one of his life. Outside, winter continued sweeping across Beacon Harbor. Inside Maple Court, something much quieter had begun. A decision. Ronan Ashford did not sleep much that night. From the tall windows of his penthouse overlooking the frozen harbor, Beacon Harbor stretched out in quiet rows of light. Glass towers he had financed reflected the moon across the dark water. Deals, contracts, expansion plans, his life had always moved with relentless precision. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image: a small girl running through the snow, holding $2 in shaking hands. By sunrise, Ronan had already made a decision that surprised even himself. He canceled half of his morning meetings. An hour later, he stood again outside Maple Court, holding a paper bag filled with breakfast pastries, fruit milk, and a small pair of winter gloves he had bought for Noah. When Evie opened the door, she looked genuinely startled to see him again. "You came back," she said. Ronan lifted the paper bag slightly. "Breakfast?" Inside the apartment, the warm smell of fresh bread slowly filled the room. Noah sat at the table, rubbing sleep from his eyes while Evie unpacked the bag carefully. But after a moment, she stopped. Her expression grew serious. "We don't want charity," she said gently. There was no anger in her voice, only dignity. Ronan nodded slowly. "Then what do you want?" he asked. Evie didn't hesitate. "We just want to stay here." She looked around the small apartment, the narrow bed, the folding table, the cracked window frame where sunlight now slipped through. "This is our home." Ronan followed her gaze. To an outsider, the room was tiny and worn. But to Evie and Noah, it held something far more valuable. It held memory. And standing there, Ronan suddenly realized something unsettling. In cities like Beacon Harbor, homes like Maple Court rarely survived long once development money began circling. And if his instincts were right, this building might already be in someone's sights. Later that afternoon, Ronan stood across the street from Maple Court, studying the building more carefully in the pale winter light. Now that he looked closely, the pattern was impossible to ignore. On one side of the block stood a newly completed luxury condominium tower, 25 floors of reflective glass and steel balconies. On the other side, construction cranes hung above another building, still wrapped in scaffolding. Between them sat Maple Court. Old brick, peeling window frames, a creaking fire escape shifting gently in the wind. To developers, it looked like the last missing piece of an expensive puzzle. And then a black sedan pulled up beside the curb. The man who stepped out wore a camel-colored cashmere coat and polished leather shoes that had likely never touched a street like this before. His silver hair was cut perfectly. Two assistants followed behind him carrying tablets and folders. Ronan recognized him immediately. Sterling Vale, one of the most aggressive real estate developers on the East Coast. Entire neighborhoods had transformed after Vale targeted them. Luxury towers, waterfront hotels, private penthouses. Opportunity followed him. So did displacement. Sterling glanced once at Maple Court. Then he smiled. Not warmly, calculatingly. A few moments later, the two men stood facing each other in the dim lobby. "I didn't expect to see you in a building like this," Sterling said pleasantly. Ronan's tone remained calm, "and I didn't expect redevelopment notices to move this quickly." Sterling shrugged lightly. "Cities evolve," he said. "Progress doesn't wait for sentiment." Ronan glanced toward the stairwell where several residents watched nervously. "People live here," he replied quietly. Sterling followed his gaze. "Yes," he said, "for now." Then he adjusted his coat and walked out into the winter light. The lobby felt colder after he left, and somewhere above them in apartment 3C2 children were still trying to hold on to the only home they had left. 3 days later, the notice appeared. It was taped neatly beside the mailboxes in the Maple Court lobby, printed on official letterhead filled with dense legal language. Most residents didn't understand every paragraph, but they understood the last line. Notice of property redevelopment and tenant vacancy requirements. Within hours, the hallway filled with worried voices. Neighbors gathered in small clusters around the paper, reading it again and again. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered about finding new apartments, though everyone knew how difficult that had become in Beacon Harbor. Affordable homes had disappeared from the city years ago. When Evie returned from the pharmacy carrying Noah's medicine, she stopped in front of the notice and studied it carefully. She read slowly, moving her finger under each line. Then she lowered the paper. Ronan arrived a few minutes later and found her standing there alone. "Do you understand it?" he asked gently. Evie nodded. "They're saying everyone has to leave." Noah tugged at her sleeve, confused by the tension around them. Evie knelt beside him and brushed a loose strand of hair from his forehead. Then she stood again and looked up at Ronan. Her voice was calm, but her eyes carried a question far too serious for a child. "Will my brother lose his home?" The words hung quietly in the hallway. Ronan looked around at the residents, reading the notice, the worn tiles beneath their feet, the stairwell that had carried thousands of ordinary lives up and down its steps. Someone had decided Maple Court was just property. But Ronan Ashford suddenly knew something else with absolute certainty. This building wasn't just part of a real estate plan. It was a promise waiting to be defended, and he had just stepped into the middle of it. That night, Ronan Ashford sat in the glass conference room at the top of Ashford Urban Systems headquarters, long after most of the city had gone quiet. Beacon Harbor's harbor lights reflected across the dark water outside, but inside the room, the only glow came from the documents spread across the polished table. Across from him sat Gideon Hale, the attorney Ronan trusted whenever a problem required precision instead of noise. Gideon was in his late 40s, calm by nature, the kind of lawyer who rarely raised his voice but almost never lost a case. The redevelopment notice from Maple Court lay at the center of the table. Gideon tapped the paper thoughtfully. Technically, he said, the notice itself isn't illegal. Ronan leaned back in his chair. But the speed of it is suspicious. Gideon slid a folder across the table. Inside were decades of property records, ownership transfers, redevelopment permits, tax agreements, and zoning approvals tied to Maple Court. Ronan scanned the documents. The pattern was strange. Over the past 20 years, the building had changed ownership 3 different times, each transfer routed through small shell companies before eventually connecting to larger development groups. "It looks deliberate," Ronan said quietly. Gideon nodded. "Very deliberate." He flipped to another page. This is the part that caught my attention. At the bottom of an older redevelopment agreement was a clause written in small legal print. Gideon read it aloud. "No resident family of Maple Court shall be forcibly displaced from the property without equal relocation housing provided under community protection agreements." Ronan leaned forward. "A protection covenant?" "Yes." Gideon adjusted his glasses. It was part of a housing initiative 20 years ago, designed to protect lower-income residents when neighborhoods redeveloped. Ronan studied the page. "Then Sterling Vale can't legally force them out." "Not exactly," Gideon said carefully. He slid another document forward. "The problem is that the activation paperwork for the covenant appears to be missing." Ronan looked up. If the covenant wasn't officially activated in the registry records, it may not hold in court. Silence settled over the room. One missing document. That was all it might take for an entire building to lose its protection. And somewhere across the city, an 8-year-old girl was still trying to keep her brother warm inside a place the law might soon erase. 2 days later, Ronan returned to Maple Court. Winter sunlight spilled weakly through the narrow lobby windows, catching the dust in the air and turning it into thin strands of gold. The eviction notice still hung beside the mailboxes, but someone had taped a small handwritten message beneath it. "We belong here." Ronan stood staring at it when an elderly woman approached slowly from the hallway. Her name, he soon learned, was Lenora Pike. She had lived in Maple Court for almost 30 years. When Ronan mentioned the name Celeste Wren, her expression softened instantly. "Oh," she said quietly. "Celeste." Lenora leaned against the railing, her voice growing distant with memory. She was the kind of person who noticed when someone needed help before they asked. Ronan listened. "If a neighbor was sick, she brought soup," Lenora continued. "If a parent had to work late, she watched the kids. She organized grocery swaps, heating repair petitions, even reading groups for the little ones in the lobby." Lenora smiled faintly. She didn't have much money herself, but she had heart. Ronan asked the question that had been waiting in his mind. "What happened to her?" Lenora's smile faded gently. "Cancer," she said. "Fast." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lenora looked toward the stairwell leading up to apartment 3C, but she left something stronger than money behind. Ronan followed her gaze. Evie's door stood closed upstairs. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. Lenora smiled again, this time with a hint of pride. "That little girl. She's got her mother's strength." Ronan felt something shift inside him. Celeste Wren had once helped protect the very building now under threat. And now her daughter, the girl who had chased a stranger through the snow to return $2, was standing in the middle of the same fight. History had a strange way of circling back. The question was whether anyone would notice it in time. The first hearing was scheduled faster than anyone expected. The municipal courtroom in Beacon Harbor was small and crowded that morning. Residents from Maple Court filled 2 rows of benches bundled in coats and scarves, whispering nervously as they waited. Many had never been inside a courthouse before. Evie sat beside Ronan quietly. Her hair had been brushed neatly that morning, and she wore a navy coat borrowed from one of the neighbors upstairs. Her small hands rested calmly in her lap. Noah stayed outside the courtroom with Lenora coloring pictures on the back of an old grocery receipt. Across the room sat Sterling Vale. He looked completely at ease. His legal team was larger, louder, and clearly accustomed to winning. When the hearing began, Sterling's attorney stood first. "Your Honor, The lawyer said smoothly, "This case concerns an outdated residential structure located within a redevelopment corridor vital to the city's economic future." He paced slowly across the courtroom. The property owners intend to replace Maple Court with modern housing that will provide increased safety efficiency and economic value. Several residents shifted uncomfortably. Then the lawyer continued. "While we sympathize with the current occupants' property rights and urban development must ultimately prevail over emotional attachment." The words felt cold in the room. Gideon Hale stood next. "This case," he said calmly, "is not about nostalgia." He placed a document on the clerk's desk. "It is about whether a legally binding promise to protect resident families still matters." The tension in the courtroom tightened instantly, but Sterling's attorney wasn't finished. "There is another issue," he said. He turned toward the judge. "Some individuals currently residing in Maple Court, specifically minor children, lack legally recognized guardianship documentation." A murmur rippled through the room. The lawyer continued calmly. "Without a legal guardian, tenancy protections cannot apply to them." Evie's hand tightened slightly in her lap. The words were technical, but their meaning was devastating. If the court accepted that argument, 2 children could be erased from the case entirely, and the fight for Maple Court would collapse before it truly began. The courtroom had grown so quiet that even the faint scratching of the court reporter's pen seemed unusually loud. Sterling Vale's attorney sat down confidently, convinced the argument had landed exactly where it needed to. If the court accepted the logic he had just presented, the consequences would be simple. Without legally recognized guardianship, the 2 children living in Maple Court would not qualify as protected tenants. Legally speaking, they would almost disappear from the case. And if they disappeared from the case, the entire defense surrounding Maple Court could begin to unravel. Evie sat beside Ronan Ashford, her small hands folded tightly together in her lap. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She was listening carefully, trying to understand why a room full of adults was debating whether she belonged somewhere. Ronan felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent decades inside rooms like this, boardrooms, negotiation halls, investment panels, but never had a single argument felt so cold. Across the aisle, Sterling Vale remained composed. He watched the proceedings with the relaxed confidence of a man accustomed to seeing his plans succeed. Then Gideon Hale slowly stood. The room shifted. Gideon adjusted his glasses and addressed the judge with calm precision. "Your Honor," he said, "the opposing counsel raises a concern regarding guardianship." The judge leaned slightly forward. "Yes," Gideon glanced briefly toward Ronan. "That concern," he continued, "has already been addressed." A ripple of confusion moved through the courtroom. Sterling's attorney frowned slightly. The judge looked toward Gideon again. "Explain." Gideon turned. "Mr. Ashford." Ronan stood. Even Sterling Vale straightened slightly in his chair, curiosity replacing certainty. Ronan's voice was steady. "This morning," he said, "I filed emergency guardianship paperwork for Evelyn Wren and Noah Wren." The reaction in the courtroom was immediate. Gasps, whispers. Even the judge's expression shifted. "You are requesting legal guardianship of these children?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor." Why, Ronan didn't hesitate. "They need someone legally responsible to stand with them." He paused briefly before continuing. "And because no child should lose her home because the system failed to notice her." For a moment, the courtroom seemed suspended in silence. The judge reviewed the documents Gideon handed to the clerk. "Temporary guardianship is unusual under these circumstances," she said carefully. Ronan nodded. "I understand. But these children have lived in Maple Court continuously," he continued. "Their mother's residency ties them directly to the community covenant under dispute." He looked toward Evie. "They deserve someone to stand beside them." The judge considered the paperwork carefully. Then she spoke. "Pending review, the court grants provisional standing to Mr. Ashford to represent the minors in this case." A quiet wave of murmurs moved through the courtroom. Sterling Vale's attorney looked suddenly less certain. The argument they had relied on removing the children from the case entirely had collapsed. Evie slowly turned toward Ronan. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Does this mean we're not alone anymore?" Ronan knelt beside her chair. "No," he said gently. "You're not." And in that moment, the fight for Maple Court truly began. The hearing recessed for the afternoon. But the tension in the courtroom did not disappear when the judge's gavel struck the bench. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already begun gathering, sensing the unusual story unfolding inside. A billionaire seeking guardianship of 2 children. A redevelopment fight. An old housing covenant suddenly resurfacing. For Ronan Ashford and Gideon Hale, the next 12 hours became a race against time. Inside the municipal archive building, rows of metal shelves stretched endlessly beneath yellow fluorescent lights. Boxes filled with decades of housing records sat stacked like forgotten history. If the Maple Court Covenant had truly been activated 20 years earlier, there had to be proof somewhere. But finding it would not be easy. At a long wooden table in the archive room, Gideon flipped through file after file, while Ronan studied old redevelopment packets. Dust hung in the air. Time moved slowly. After 2 hours, Gideon leaned back in his chair. If the activation document was never filed, he said quietly, the covenant may not survive legal scrutiny. Ronan didn't answer. Instead, he opened another folder. Its label read, Maple Court Community Housing Initiative, 2003. Inside were meeting minutes, development approvals, and foundation reports connected to the original redevelopment project that had preserved Maple Court 2 decades earlier. Ronan flipped through the pages carefully. Then he paused. Something small had been stapled to the back of the packet. A narrow attachment. He pulled it closer. The heading read, Covenant Implementation Annex. Gideon leaned forward immediately. "Wait," he said. They read the document together. The annex confirmed that the anti-displacement covenant had been formally activated as part of the tax approval for the redevelopment agreement, which meant the clause protecting Maple Court residents was not symbolic. It was legally binding. Even more importantly, the covenant applied to all future property owners who benefited from the redevelopment zoning agreement. Gideon slowly leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said quietly, "that changes everything." Ronan stared down at the paper, because beneath the legal text was something else. A handwritten notation referencing the original community organizers involved in the housing initiative. One name stood out, Celeste Wren, Evie's mother. The woman who had written the note telling her daughter to always return what wasn't hers. She hadn't just lived in Maple Court, she had helped protect it. And now, 20 years later, her daughter was fighting to save the same building. History, Ronan realized, had just handed them the truth they needed. The question was whether the court would listen in time. The next morning, the courtroom filled again. Word of the case had spread quickly across Beacon Harbor. A few reporters sat quietly in the back row, notebooks ready. Maple Court residents filled nearly every available seat, whispering nervously among themselves. Evie sat beside Ronan once again. Her borrowed navy coat was buttoned carefully, and her dark hair had been brushed neatly by Lenora that morning. Across the room, Sterling Vale appeared just as confident as before. But this time, Gideon Hale carried a thick folder under his arm. When the judge entered the room, immediately fell silent. "Court is now in session." Sterling's attorney stood first. "Your Honor?" He began smoothly. "The defense continues to rely on an outdated covenant whose legal activation has not yet been verified within the official registry." He paused briefly. "Without formal implementation documentation, the covenant's protections cannot reasonably apply to the present property dispute." A murmur spread through the courtroom. That was the core of their strategy. If the covenant had never been officially activated, the entire defense would collapse. The judge turned toward Gideon. "Mr. Hale," she said, Do you have documentation confirming the covenant's legal implementation? Gideon stood. Yes, Your Honor. He walked calmly toward the clerk's desk and placed the document on the table. The defense has located the official covenant implementation annex attached to the 2003 redevelopment approval. The judge studied the document carefully. Pages turned slowly. Across the courtroom, Sterling Vale leaned forward slightly for the first time since the trial began. Minutes passed. Finally, the judge looked up. The court recognizes this annex as valid documentation confirming the covenant's formal activation. A wave of whispers moved through the gallery. She continued reading. This covenant includes a binding clause preventing the forced displacement of resident families without provision of equivalent protected housing. The judge turned toward Sterling's attorney. The redevelopment proposal currently before this court does not satisfy those conditions. The words landed quietly, but their meaning was enormous. Sterling's attorney sat down slowly, because in that moment, the balance of the case had shifted. The promise made 20 years ago had proof, and now the law would decide whether that promise still mattered. Ronan looked down at Evie. She didn't yet fully understand everything happening in the courtroom, but she understood one thing. The fight for her home was no longer invisible, and for the first time since the eviction notice appeared, hope had returned to Maple Court. The courtroom felt different that morning, not louder, but heavier. News about the Maple Court case had begun spreading through Beacon Harbor overnight. A few more reporters had appeared in the back rows, whispering quietly while adjusting their cameras. Residents filled nearly every bench. Some sat with their hands folded tightly in their laps. Others leaned forward anxiously, as if the distance between them and the judge's bench somehow made the outcome harder to reach. Evie sat beside Ronan Ashford once again. She had become used to the quiet rhythm of the courtroom, now the creak of wooden benches, the soft turning of legal pages, the measured voices of lawyers speaking carefully chosen words. But today felt different. Even the air seemed tense. Across the room, Sterling Vale sat perfectly composed, though his posture had grown slightly more rigid since the covenant annex had appeared the previous day. The judge entered. The courtroom rose. Then the proceedings resumed. Sterling's attorney stood first. Your Honor, he began smoothly. While the defense has presented documentation regarding the covenant's historical implementation, we must also consider the realities of modern urban development. He paced slowly before the bench. The Maple Court building is structurally outdated and inefficient. Redevelopment would provide hundreds of new housing units, economic growth, and increased safety standards. He paused briefly. Cities evolve. Progress requires difficult transitions. Several Maple Court residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The attorney continued. While we sympathize with current occupants, property law must allow reasonable redevelopment when circumstances demand it. The argument was polished, carefully constructed, but it treated Maple Court as a structure, not a community. When he finished, Gideon Hale rose slowly. He adjusted his glasses and walked toward the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, Gideon said calmly, the opposing counsel is correct about one thing. The room grew still. Cities do evolve. He paused. But the law exists precisely to ensure that progress does not erase people who were promised protection. Gideon placed several documents before the court. These residents were not simply living in Maple Court by coincidence. They were living there under a legally protected housing covenant created to prevent displacement during redevelopment. He turned slightly toward the gallery. That promise was made by the city itself. The judge listened closely. Gideon continued. If such promises are discarded whenever redevelopment becomes profitable, then housing protections become meaningless. Silence spread through the courtroom. Then Gideon added quietly, the question before this court is simple. Does the law still honor the promises it made to ordinary people? No one moved. because everyone in the room understood what was truly being decided. Not just a building, but whether a promise written 20 years earlier still mattered. The next witness surprised many people in the courtroom. Gideon Hale called Lenora Pike to the stand. The elderly woman walked slowly toward the witness chair, leaning lightly on her cane. Her silver hair was neatly pinned behind her head, and despite the nervous tremble in her hands, her eyes remained steady. Gideon spoke gently. "Ms. Pike, how long have you lived at Maple Court?" "Almost 30 years, she answered. "And during that time, did you know a woman named Celeste Wren?" A soft smile crossed Lenora's face. "Oh yes," she said. "Everyone knew Celeste." Gideon nodded. "Can you tell the court about her?" Lenora took a moment before answering. Her voice was quiet but clear enough for the entire courtroom to hear. Celeste was the kind of person who noticed when someone needed help before they asked. Several Maple Court residents nodded quietly in the gallery. "If a neighbor was sick, she brought soup," Lenora continued. "If a parent had to work late, she watched the children. She organized grocery-sharing winter coat drives and community meetings so people could understand their housing rights." Lenora's voice grew steadier as she spoke. She believed people deserved a place to stay, no matter how rich the neighborhood became. Gideon glanced briefly toward Evie. "What happened after Celeste Wren passed away?" Lenora's smile faded gently. "She got sick," she said. Very quickly, the courtroom remained silent. "And her children?" Gideon asked softly. Lenora looked toward the benches where Evie sat. "They stayed," she said. "And who cared for them?" Lenora's eyes moved back to Gideon. "The little girl." A murmur spread quietly through the room. "She takes care of her brother the same way Celeste used to take care of everyone else," Lenora continued. Her voice softened. "Celeste used to say that homes weren't made of walls. They were made of people looking out for each other." Lenora turned toward the judge. "That building stayed alive because of her." She paused. "And now her daughter is trying to keep it alive, too." For a moment, even the lawyers remained silent, because what Lenora had described was something the law rarely captured in words: a community, and the invisible work that kept it together. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. After the final testimony ended, the judge leaned back slightly in her chair, reviewing the documents one last time. The covenant annex, the redevelopment filings, the testimony about Maple Court's history. Across the aisle, Sterling Vale sat with his hands folded neatly in front of him, though the faint tightening of his jaw suggested the confidence he had carried into the trial was beginning to fade. Evie sat quietly beside Ronan. Her feet didn't quite reach the floor. She didn't understand every legal detail being discussed, but she understood enough to know something important was about to happen. The judge finally spoke. "The court has carefully reviewed the documentation presented in this case." Her voice carried clearly across the room. The Maple Court Housing Covenant was formally implemented in 2003 as part of a redevelopment agreement tied to municipal tax approval. She turned a page in the document. That covenant includes binding protections preventing the forced displacement of resident families without the provision of equivalent relocation housing under community protection guidelines. A few Maple Court residents leaned forward anxiously. The judge looked toward Sterling's legal team. "The redevelopment proposal currently before this court does not meet those requirements." The room fell silent. Then she delivered the words that would change everything. "Therefore, the eviction action against the residents of Maple Court is denied." For a moment, no one moved. The sentence seemed to echo slowly through the courtroom. Then the meaning reached the gallery. A quiet wave of relief spread through the benches. Someone wiped away tears. Someone else laughed softly in disbelief. Across the aisle, Sterling Vale remained composed, though the loss was clear in his expression. The judge struck the gavel once. "The residents of Maple Court are protected under the covenant. This court orders an immediate suspension of the redevelopment eviction action. It was over. Ronan turned slowly toward Evie. She searched his face, unsure what had just happened. Then he nodded gently. "You get to stay," he said, for the first time since the eviction notice had appeared on the Maple Court wall. Evie smiled, and somehow that small smile made the entire courtroom feel warmer. The courthouse steps were crowded when Ronan Ashford and the Maple Court residents finally stepped outside. Winter sunlight reflected across the wet pavement, brighter now than it had seemed that morning. Reporters called out questions, cameras flashing as they tried to capture the unusual story that had unfolded inside the courtroom. A billionaire, 2 children, an old building, and a promise from 20 years ago that had just changed everything. But Ronan ignored the reporters. His attention was on the small girl walking beside him. Evie still seemed unsure how to process what had just happened. She held Noah's hand tightly as they moved down the courthouse steps together. "You said we get to stay," she said quietly. Ronan nodded. "Yes." Evie looked back toward the courthouse doors. The judge said that she did. Evie took a moment to absorb the answer. Then she simply said, "Okay." It wasn't excitement. It was relief. The kind of relief that comes when fear has been sitting quietly inside someone for far too long. Nearby, Lenora Pike hugged several Maple Court neighbors who had gathered outside. "We did it," one of them whispered. But Ronan knew the truth. Winning in court didn't guarantee the building's future. Legal protection could slow developers down. It couldn't stop time. And Maple Court had been aging for decades. Later that evening, Ronan stood once again across the street from the building. The old brick structure looked almost fragile in the fading light. Cracked windows, old heating systems, pipes that had probably been repaired more times than anyone could count. He imagined the future Sterling Vale had planned. A glass tower rising here. Luxury apartments with harbor views. Private elevators. Valet parking. Maple Court would vanish beneath it without leaving a trace, except for the people who had once lived there. Ronan looked up toward the 3rd-floor window where Evie and Noah lived. A warm light glowed inside, and suddenly the decision felt obvious. The court had protected Maple Court, but protection alone wasn't enough. If this building was going to survive, someone had to believe in it long after the headlines disappeared. The next morning, Ronan called Gideon Hale. "I want to buy Maple Court," he said. There was a brief pause on the line. "Personally," Gideon asked. "No," Ronan replied. "For the people who already live there. Because sometimes the most important promise isn't the one written in legal documents. It's the one someone chooses to keep." Spring arrived slowly in Beacon Harbor that year. The snow melted first from the sidewalks, then from the rooftops, and finally from the narrow streets surrounding Maple Court. But the biggest change wasn't the weather. It was the building itself. Within weeks of the court ruling, Ronan Ashford quietly finalized a new ownership agreement for Maple Court through a housing trust designed to preserve the covenant protections permanently. Instead of demolition plans, construction crews arrived with something very different. Repair permits. The residents watched the transformation with cautious curiosity. Old pipes were replaced. Heating systems were upgraded. Cracked stair railings were repaired. The lobby received new lighting for the first time in years. Workers repainted the hallways but carefully preserved the building's original brick and wood details. Ronan had insisted on that. Maple Court would be improved, but it would still feel like Maple Court. Inside apartment 3C, Evie watched the changes with quiet fascination. One afternoon, she stood beside Ronan near the lobby while electricians installed new lights above the mailboxes. "Are they fixing everything?" she asked. "Almost everything," Ronan said with a small smile. Evie thought for a moment. "My mom used to say houses get tired too," she said. Ronan nodded. She was right. Not every change was visible. Some repairs were deeper, New legal protections ensured no resident could be forced out during renovations. Temporary apartments were arranged nearby while certain units were repaired. Community meetings allowed tenants to help decide how the building should evolve. Slowly, Maple Court began to feel alive again. Neighbors who had once spoken quietly in the hallways now gathered in the lobby to watch the renovations unfold. Children played near the stairwell after school. Lenora Pike even organized a small community dinner in the lobby one evening, using folding tables and borrowed chairs. For the first time in years, Maple Court felt less like a building waiting to disappear, and more like a place returning to life. But Ronan had one final addition planned. Something small, something permanent. Something that would ensure the story of Maple Court and the woman who helped protect it long before anyone else noticed would never be forgotten. On a warm afternoon near the beginning of summer, Maple Court gathered for a small ceremony in the building's newly restored lobby. It wasn't a large event. No reporters, no speeches from city officials, just the people who lived there. The construction workers who had helped repair the building, and a few neighbors who had watched the long fight unfold from across the street. Near the entrance, a bronze plaque had been mounted on the wall beside the mailboxes. A cloth covered it for the moment. Evie stood beside Ronan holding Noah's hand. When the cloth was gently removed, the plaque revealed a short inscription. Maple Court Community Residence in honor of Celeste Wren, whose kindness built the heart of this home. Lenora Pike wiped her eyes quietly. Several residents applauded softly. Evie stared at the plaque for a long time. "My mom helped people here," she said. "She did," Ronan replied. Evie nodded slowly. She liked this place. Ronan glanced around the bright lobby. Sunlight streamed through the repaired windows. Children laughed near the staircase. Neighbors talked comfortably near the mailboxes. "It likes you too," he said. A moment later, Evie reached into the pocket of her coat. She pulled out a small piece of wax paper. Inside were two slightly wrinkled $1 bills. The same money she had chased Ronan's car to return on that freezing winter night. She placed the bills in Ronan's hand. "My mom said honest money matters," Evie said softly. Ronan looked down at the small bills. Then he closed his hand gently around them. "Promises do too," he replied. Noah tugged lightly on Evie's sleeve. "Are we staying here forever?" he asked. Evie looked around the lobby again. The repaired walls, the warm lights, the plaque bearing her mother's name. For the first time since her mother had passed away, the word home no longer felt fragile. She squeezed Noah's hand. "Yes," she said softly. "This time, home stays." And in a building that had nearly disappeared from the city's map, something far stronger than concrete or steel had been rebuilt. A promise. And the quiet truth that sometimes the smallest act of honesty, $2 returned in the snow, can change far more than anyone expects. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our